from old routine. But the other woman.
When people talk about films that center masculine internalized homophobia, the focus is usually on the men, their relationships, their repression, and the impact of a heteronormative society that refuses to let young men find themselves. But underneath all of that, there's another side of these stories that doesn't get as much attention. The women in these films are always there, but they're often pushed to the edges of the narrative. They're simply there to push the male lead in the right direction. Their girlfriends, their wives, or they're symbols of what a normal life is supposed to look like. But rarely are they ever fully developed characters with their own perspective. In this video essay, I'm going to look at how female characters are treated in these films, and argue that their roles are shaped by the male protagonist's struggle with internalized homophobia, often reducing them to emotional support, an obstacle, or part of a performance of heterosexuality. Internalized homophobia plays a prevalent role in the two films I want to discuss today. One being Ang Lee's 2006 work Brokeback Mountain, and the other being Miles Doris Perephidy's 2016 work As You Are. In Brokeback Mountain, Alma plays the role of Ennis's wife, and ultimately is not an underwritten character. She's perceptive, emotionally aware, and arguably understands Ennis better than he understands himself. However, the film constantly limits how much access the audience has to her perspective, whittling her down to somewhat of a joke within the narrative. She's a woman who's dealing with the stress of not only being a housewife in the 1960s, but surprise, her husband is also gay. Alma can be better understood through Adrian Rich's idea of compulsory heterosexuality, where heterosexual relationships are not simply natural, but socially enforced. In this context, Alma is not just an individual character, but someone positioned within that system, expected to sustain a marriage that is built on repression rather than mutual truth. Alma simply being a sideline in the narrative is most evident in the moment she witnesses Ennis and Jack kissing. Alma becomes the first character to fully grasp the reality of their relationship, yet the film quickly shifts away from her reaction, returning instead to Ennis's internal conflict and his growing storyline alongside Jack. The film attempts to frame Alma as a villain towards the end, a moment that shifts her from a position of quiet suffering into one of apparent hostility.
Chick twist. Jack nasty.
On the surface, the insult can be read as bitterness or moral judgment. However, it emerges from a place of accumulated grief, betrayal, and emotional isolation. Rather than fully contextualizing this response, the film presents it briefly before returning to Ennis's perspective. This aligns with what Laura Mulvey describes as the way narrative cinema positions spectators to identify with specific characters, often reinforcing a dominant viewpoint. In this case, the audience is aligned with Ennis, whose internalized homophobia remains the emotional center of the film, while Alma's anger is reframed as obstruction rather than a justified response. As Russo states, mainstream films often center the tragic dimensions of homosexual lives, ultimately leaving Alma's character to remain a casualty in Ennis's emotional fallout. The film As You Are targets this completely differently. In As You Are, Sarah occupies a more visible, active narrative role compared to Alma in Brokeback Mountain, yet her function yet again remains closely tied to the boy's struggle with internalized homophobia. She becomes a shared point of interaction, through which both Jack and Mark attempt to both navigate and attempt to suppress their feelings for one another, but in much different ways. This dynamic becomes particularly clear in the way that Sarah's relationship with Jack and Mark diverge. When Jack and Sarah broke up, the separation is notably mutual and calm, reflecting Jack's growing self-awareness and acceptance of his sexuality.
You don't love me, right?
Sure I do.
But you're not in love with me, though, right?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
His relationship with Sarah functions as a transitional space, one that allows him to recognize that his feelings for Mark cannot be reconciled within a heterosexual framework. In contrast, Mark repeatedly returns to Sarah, even after it becomes clear that he loves Jack, using this relationship not as a step towards understanding himself, but as a way of actively suppressing what he feels. His persistence reflects a far deeper level of internalized homophobia, shaped by his abusive upbringing and the expectations imposed on him by his father, where heterosexuality is not just assumed, but required, aligning with what Adrian Rich describes as compulsory heterosexuality. In this sense, Sarah becomes a site of repetition rather than resolution. Her role is to facilitate Mark's attempt to correct himself. As a result, Sarah exists in a dual capacity. She's both a character with her own emotional presence, while also being a narrative tool through which the boys attempt, and ultimately fail, to resolve their internalized homophobia. For Jack, she represents acceptance and release, whereas for Mark, she embodies denial and ongoing conflict. While the film does grant her moments of her own emotional presence, such as her getting ready for prom, suggesting a degree of independence, her narrative significance is still largely defined by how she mediates the tension between the two boys. This reflects what Vito Russo identifies as a broader pattern in cinema, where queer narratives are structured around repression and conflict, often positioning other characters in relation to that struggle. This reinforces the idea that female characters in narratives of queer repression are often positioned not as independent subjects, but as mechanisms for which male characters negotiate their identities. And ultimately, his story doesn't delve deeper than that, as the end of the film once again lets the audience settle with the ending of Mark and Jack's storyline, giving her no resolution in her own struggles. Both of these films demonstrate that internalized homophobia operates not simply as an individual conflict, but as a wider social force that structures relationships and narrative roles. By examining how female characters are treated within these stories, it becomes clear that queer repression reshapes not only queer lives themselves, but also the lives of those positioned around them, and that film directors need to stop treating these women as though they are a throwaway character used to uplift queer identities, and that meaningful female characters and queer characters can exist alongside each other. But until then...
Why not?
I wish you were a girl.